Listen up, you primitive screwheads, and welcome to the first episode of Tales from the Cabin, where we look at a movie or season of Evil Dead and look at how it got adapted into Evil Dead the game. Today we'll be starting at the beginning, looking at the OG, the genre-defining video nasty, 1981's The Evil Dead. Before we jump into the game's content, it's time for a quick lesson in film history. The Evil Dead was the passion project of producers Sam Raimi and Rob Tappert and leading man Bruce Campbell in their first feature film together. It stands the test of time as one of the backbones of horror history from what many would argue was the golden decade of horror cinema, the 1980s. Many of the tropes and ideas that we recognise today as mainstays of horror come from this movie, and the franchise that spawned from it. But before The Evil Dead became the cultural icon that propelled Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell to stardom, it was a little indie film that bore the marks of a novice director working on a tight budget and wasn't without its controversies. The set was horribly unsafe, and Sam Raimi's cavalier attitude to the treatment of his actors didn't help. For example, Bruce Campbell sprained his ankle halfway through filming, and Raimi spent the rest of the shoot poking the ankle with a stick to agitate him. They got lost in the woods on the first day of shooting, injuries among the crew were common and couldn't be treated due to the cabin's remoteness, and the lenses that were used for the demonic eyes were thick as glass and could only be used for approximately 50 minutes at a time. In one instance, the actress for Linda, Betsy Baker, even ripped her eyelashes off trying to get her lenses out. The grisly violence of the finished product was also heavily criticised among moral guardians of the time, meaning the film was banned in several countries, including the UK, as it made the infamous Video Nasties list of films considered too horrific for public consumption. The infamous tree rape scene was easily the most controversial scene in the whole film, and Sam Raimi is on record saying he regretted filming it. But regardless of the controversies and bannings, a massive cult following began to coalesce around the film, helped in part by a glowing review by juggernaut of horror Stephen King. As New Line Cinema picked up The Evil Dead for distribution, publicist Irving Shapiro started pushing for a sequel that would have released in 1987, and bring with it a higher budget but much more studio control. The Evil Dead 2 brought in much of the staples of the franchise that we know today. The more comedic tone, the chainsaw, the boomstick, and even the names Deadite and Necronomicon didn't exist in the original movie. This has thrown off people who ended up going back and watching the Evil Dead series from the beginning, expecting these iconic images to come up. But just because we're not quite in groovy territory yet, doesn't mean the original movie doesn't have anything to offer. Which brings us to Evil Dead the game, and the concept of the original film that made it into the game. One of the first things you'll notice is that The Evil Dead doesn't have a playable demon associated with the movie, making it the only film that wasn't represented with a demon until the 2013 Evil Dead bundle arrived in early September. There's a very simple reason for that. The Evil Dead is a film that's primarily about possessions. There's not really a typical villain because it's about Ash's friends turning on him one at a time. There isn't someone to defeat, like in every other Evil Dead film. The only objective for everyone in that cabin is to survive. The closest thing we get to a bigger threat is the Kandarian demon, which is the unseen force that causes the possessions, and is represented by the Sam Raimi zoomy camera that follows the characters around. It's the demon in the demon role that you play as in the game, but it's not really a character, and its presence is more of a Deadite delivery service than an actual threat itself. In terms of the characters that did make it in, we've got the original incarnation of Ash Williams, along with his sister Cheryl Williams and his friend Scotty, who apparently didn't deserve a last name, as well as two non-playable characters, Professor Raymond Noby and Ash's possessed girlfriend Linda, who take the role of the announcers for Survivor and Demon side respectively. One thing I was really impressed by when I saw the list of voice credits for this game was the returning actors who are back to voice their characters, and the original Evil Dead has the most returning cast members of any installment of the franchise. Bruce Campbell is obviously reprising the role of Ash, but Ellen Sandweiss is back as Cheryl, Richard DeManincourt is back as Scotty, and even Betsy Baker returns to voice Linda, after having her character recast in every installment of the franchise she was in until that point. While I'm a huge fan of Baker's return, and she does a bang-up job voicing the character with a lot of the gleeful energy that possessed Linda had in Evil Dead 1 and 2, I can't help but feel she could have been her own character. Linda is a pretty important character, and I don't see why she's relegated to the role of an announcer. The Ash vs Evil Dead TV show gave the Necronomicon an actual voice, so make that your demon announcer and make Linda into her own playable character. Disposing of her body is one of the single player missions, so it's hard to say the game sidelines her in any way at all. I just wish she got the love all the original Evil Dead survivors clearly received. In my opinion, Cheryl Williams is the perfect exhibition of how Evil Dead the game breathes life back into older characters from the franchise. Ellen Sandweiss is back in the role of Cheryl, after she first reprised the role in a legendary performance in Ash vs Evil Dead Season 2. I can't find my source for this, but I remember reading her relationship with Sam Raimi was a little strained for a time, after the difficult experience she had on the set of the original film. But that seems to be water under the bridge now. I'm glad she's been able to return enthusiastically to the role. For what it's worth, Cheryl isn't developed very much in The Evil Dead, being the first member of the cabin crew, to become a Deadite. As the only member of the cast not to be in a romantic relationship and the one to turn down alcohol, she's kind of the shrinking Violet of the cabin, and her in-game characterization does play into this to a degree. In the game, Cheryl is pretty much the standard healer, the mercy of the cast if you will. It's a natural place to put her, I think. She's sadly defined in most of the Evil Dead as this helpless young woman whose primary job is to be victimised by the evil until it possesses her. She's not even given a proper emotional connection to our main characters. She feels like an afterthought and isn't remembered a lot in the future films, unlike Linda. As such, making her possibly the most individually vulnerable survivor in the game, who's dedicated entirely to team support, makes a lot of sense. She's not really enough of the film, and doesn't have enough agency when she is in it, to have a well-defined skill set to translate, so this rough transition between character and gameplay is sufficient. What really impressed me though was the voice line Cheryl was given and the exceptional work of Ellen Sandweiss bringing them to life. Cheryl's given a bit more personality in this game, some of which seems to have stemmed from her return in Ash vs Evil Dead, which hints at a more playful and rebellious Cheryl than we saw in the original film. In Ash vs Evil Dead, it's discovered that Cheryl had a secret relationship with Ash's friend Chet, suggesting that the shrinking Violet, innocent young Cheryl, portrayed in The Evil Dead, wasn't really the whole story, and just like everyone else in the cabin, she was a young woman navigating the strange world of growing up in her own way. The voice lines in the game support this reading of the character. For every voice line where she's begging the evil to let them go and insisting the others keep her safe, she's got another one warning Deadites to stay back.
You shoulda left me alone.
Or actually enjoying the ketamine-filled pink fuck drink.
Okay, that's actually quite nice.
For a character who got a pretty poor showing in the original film, and who mostly got ignored in the sequels in favour of Ash pining over his girlfriend Linda, it's good to see Cheryl back in full force after Sandweiss's unforgettable reprisal in Ash vs Evil Dead. Speaking of excellent reprisals, Bruce Campbell, as usual, puts in a stellar performance in the role of Ash, and it helps he's got one of those voices that doesn't really age. Suspending disbelief that a 64-year-old man voicing 20-year-old Ash doesn't become an issue. I like that this version of Ash is the support of all the Ashes. It fits really well with his role in the movie. Ash was meant to be this gender-flipped final girl, a far cry from the badass man of action he becomes in the sequels. A core element of the final girl is their role as the story's emotional centre, a reassuring presence if you will, and that role typically takes precedence over actually saving the day. Support Ash's active skill, reassuring presence, is representative of Ash's role in the wider story. He's the ray of hope that the other characters and the audience hold on to that everyone will make it out alive. Sadly, that's not quite how the story goes. By the end, Ash barely saves himself and loses everybody else who went to the cabin with him. He's not the chosen one, he's not the Hefe, he's hanging on by the skin of his teeth. The general vibe of support Ash's passive skills merge Ash's two identities in The Evil Dead. The supportive friend and the desperate survivor, to make him a proper battle healer. Someone whose grit and perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds carried him through the film. His passive skill, alternative healing, is a perfect way to express this in-game. Heavy melee attacks heal your team, so unlike the other supports, you're incentivized to take direct fight and help your other melee damage dealers get stuck in. Support your friends while fighting for your own survival. I don't really love the marked target mechanic that allows his team to heal off and deal extra damage to units that he marks with headshots, because it suggests a level of precision that I don't think Ash has ever had. But it's a unique and skill-expressive way for Ash to fit into the battle hero archetype, so I don't hate it. One thing I really enjoy is the level of self-awareness Evil Dead 1 Ash's voice lines bring to the table. Because the Evil Dead is so totally different from the rest of the series, it makes sense that Baby Ash gets some dialogue that's kind of wink-wink nudge-nudging the players about the character's future. Like when he picks up the boomstick, for example.
Oh, I feel a strange connection with this one.
Or the insistence that he can't die, that he has to survive.
I'm gonna make it out of here. I have to.
Because, well, if he died this early on, there wouldn't be any more movies. There's a bit of humour to the character, if only because of how different he is to every other incarnation of Ash. He clearly doesn't want to fight if he can avoid it, is frequently confused at what he's up against, and when the evil finds him, he's genuinely frightened, as opposed to shrugging it off with a quick joke and rev of the old chainsaw because, well, he doesn't even have the chainsaw yet. For those who are super used to Ash being this blasé, lovable idiot badass, it's almost jarring to hear that same voice asking in desperation what the hell they're gonna do next. And that's very much the point. In terms of playable characters, that just leaves Richard Demandingcore Scotty, and honestly, I didn't really know what to expect. Scotty's one of the more fleshed out characters in the film, filling out the typically masculine jock archetype as the handsome and heroic man of action. Except he kinda doesn't, as he regresses into cowardice when the horrors of the cabin start to prove too much for him. Scotty's portrayal in the game is pretty unflattering, with his bravado masking a scared and kinda pathetic man who's perfectly willing to throw his friends to the wolves to save his own skin.
Somebody's down? I say we leave him here and get the hell out.
While this is an idea that the original film does play with Scotty having to kill Shelley and his macho persona breaking down, Scotty was always portrayed as someone who genuinely cared about Ash and the others at the cabin, even if he ultimately cared about himself more. The game incarnation of Scotty is much more openly selfish and insecure, so while it could be considered a Flanderization, I like that it gives Scotty a clearly defined personality that makes his flavour of bravado distinct from, say, Army of Darkness Ash. Every character in this game is a badass of some flavour, but Scotty's the only one who wants to make sure that everyone else notices it, and relies on that to validate his masculinity. It's a logical leap from his portrayal in the film, and I think his exposure therapy skill where he becomes more resistant to fear whenever he kills an enemy is a great exhibition of that bravado. When the going's good, Scotty's confidence is unshakable, and he only starts to give in to the fear when his back's against the wall and he's running out of options. All things considered, Scotty is one of the least consequential characters in the whole Evil Dead franchise, but I'm still glad he got a good showing in the game, even if I do wish they'd given him a surname like every other character in the game. While he's undoubtedly the most forgettable of the Evil Dead 1 crew, he still deserves his place in the game, and makes a really fun choice of warrior who's quite different from the damage sponge Henry, the glass cannon Mia, and jack of all trades Ash, whose particular strengths at mob clearing and disruption fit with a character as boisterous as Scotty. For playable characters for now, that pretty much does it. Although Professor Raymond Noby and Ash's possessed girlfriend Linda, who take the roles of the game's announcers, also make their debuts in the original Evil Dead. Despite being voiced by Linda's voice actor from the first film, Linda's dialogue and visual design seems to be based more on her portrayal at the start of Evil Dead 2, so it's not really worth talking about her in this video. But Noby, on the other hand, seems to be closer to his original portrayal than his more villainous streak exhibited by Nicholas Hope's performance in Atra's Evil Dead. While he doesn't make an appearance in the flesh until Evil Dead 2's flashbacks, Noby's voice is a constant presence throughout the original Evil Dead, sets the tone for the mystery the teenagers face, and is the first hint at just how out of their depth they actually are. Quite separate from the duplicitous and somewhat selfish depiction of Noby in the TV series, this game's version of Noby is incredibly regretful of what he's unleashed onto the world, and having him guide the survivor player fits with Noby's role as exposition provider to direct the characters in the film. In addition, a number of weapons and props in the original film appear in the game. The shovel is the weapon used by Ash to decapitate his possessed girlfriend at the end of the film, and Scotty uses the lumberjack axe to cut possessed Shelley apart. The hunting rifle in the game is also taken from the original design of the weapon that would become the boomstick in the original Evil Dead. Despite the boomstick being iconic as a saw-nut double-barreled shotgun, it didn't become a double barrel until the sequel. The original weapon in the cabin was a Winchester 37A 20-gauge single-barrel shotgun. Despite not technically being a hunting rifle, It has a lot more in common with the hunting rifle in the game than it does with the actual shotgun. It doesn't have the muzzle choke that the shotgun has, and the Winchester was break action instead of pump action. However, this is pretty much where the weapons end, since the franchise didn't really go heavy on the weapons until the sequels. And with weaponry done, that's everything really covered. This video is likely to be a bit shorter than later entries in the series, because the Evil Dead just didn't have as much to work with as the sequels in the franchise that turned Evil Dead into a household name. But just because we all know Evil Dead for groovy inclusions like the chainsaw and the boomstick, doesn't mean the original is worth forgetting. If anything, it's the opposite. The horror of the original film was undiluted by the comedy elements that seeped into the franchise over time, giving way to brutal violence and a genuine stark desperation to survive that's never been truly replicated. There's a reason the remake of Evil Dead tried to go back to the series' humorless roots to give us the scariest Evil Dead film we'd ever seen. Both when the violence is totally devoid of slapstick and our cast of characters is still new enough that we don't know who's going to survive, the stakes become real again. When we see Ash fighting skeletons in Army of Darkness, or chopping up deadites in the TV show, we never think he might really die. He's Ash Williams, he's our leading man. His plot armour is as bulletproof as that indestructible blue shirt. The original entry doesn't have that safety and security of a familiar, confident face to guide us through the horrors of the Kandarian demon. Ash is just as lost as the rest of the cast and the audience, creating an engrossing horror experience that's aged surprisingly well given the meagre budget and the 40 years that have passed since its production. Yeah, it doesn't have the endlessly quotable lines of Evil Dead 2 or the badass man of action Ash in Army of Darkness, but 1981's The Evil Dead is proof that if you're looking for a compelling horror experience that defined a genre for decades, sometimes you can't beat the original.
You can't beat the original.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce? That's everything I have to say about 1981's The Evil Dead. I've really been enjoying Evil Dead lately, and I cannot wait to make more content about it. If you're interested, please do subscribe, and keep an eye open on my socials, links to all of them in the description, so that you don't miss the next one. You can also find me on Twitch, where we stream a mixture of Evil Dead and Dead by Daylight. But while I am excited to make future videos on Evil Dead, I do have another Dead by Daylight video planned out for next week, and it's covering the very last killer that I haven't made a video on yet. It's a licensed killer, and if you've been paying attention, you'll know who it is. And if not, I guess you'll just have to wait and see who will be left, and what will be left of them. I'll see you next time.